All right. So let me see. Let me set a quick timer just in case. All right. Well, I'm very happy to be here. Some of the talks that came right before the one I'm about to start were really helpful. And in a way, I see some of the stuff that I'm going to go through as very much complementary to some of the things that Lana and Netta specifically went through. So, there are essentially three things that I'd like you all to take on, if at all, from this talk. One is to consider some of the things that Lana already mentioned from artificial life as having some sort of intrinsic value of their own. And then two other messages that have to do with abstraction. And when I mention abstraction, I mean mathematical abstraction. So I mean, taking seriously the idea, taking seriously the point of having a mathematical theory of what life is. So, of course, I'm not here to tell you that I have one, but I'm here to tell you that there are some things that we can say about that haven't already been said before. So, I think by now we are all fine and comfortable with the idea that there's no clear definition of life. I will try to take at least a current working definition as an example of some of the points that I'm trying to drive home. So this is the standard NASA's definition, nothing new there. We can see that essentially it takes already the two main perspectives of the origins of life within it. So we can see that it considers what it means for a system to be self-sustaining, a chemical system to be self-sustaining. And we have various simulations of various kinds that try to actually mimic some of the properties behind this self-maintenance behavior. And then we also have the idea of Darwinian evolution that is also being modeled by different, systems of different kinds in order to better understand, life as we see it here on Earth. Now, the quote that I'm reporting here comes from, I guess one of the founders of my alma mater, Sussex University, John Maynard Smith, who in 1992 brought to the attention of, his audience at the time, the idea of thinking more seriously about comparative biology. So not thinking about a single, phylogenetic tree, but thinking about multiple ones, thinking about ones that we may not have seen yet, if you are in the business of astrobiology, for example, or taking more seriously the fact that we may have to look at artificial ones. So creating artificial universes and taking them for what they are and actually understand what their properties are from their own perspective. Now, some of artificial life, as Lana, already mentioned, takes this, very seriously. And one of the systems that was also in Lana's talk is this linear idea. And the music is pretty nice. So here, we have, the idea of actually trying to consider, life for what it is within this system. This is a cellular automaton, so it obeys very clear mathematical rules. You can simulate this with 15 lines of code that can be optimized, of course. But the point is that this shows quite a lot of complexity. It shows replications. It shows some very basic form, perhaps, of evolution. It shows different shapes. It shows stability of different kinds, metastability. There's an entire universe that we can, carve out of this particular simulation in order to understand perhaps some properties of life. So take life more seriously and take it more seriously in an artificial context. So we have seen already, in some of the previous talks, the idea of evolution as, some sort of, I want to call it maybe, let's say, a gradient of some sort, or there is an axis that people use when they think about evolution. They associate that with time. We go back eons, we see really simple systems, and from really simple systems we get the sort of complexity that we see nowadays, and also complexity that we don't see anymore nowadays. The point is that we have somewhat been able to abstract some of the very fundamental rules of an evolving system. So this is an example from the 90s, Avida. There are multiple ones by now, Terra, some other ones were also mentioned in the previous talk. We can see that there are features of evolving systems that we can capture completely in silico. They don't tell us exactly what life is, but they tell us something very fundamental about evolution, and they tell us something that doesn't have to go through all of the complexity of life as we know it here on Earth. This is, however, not what I want to focus on. This is something that has already been done. It can surely be improved, but my point is this has been done before. What I think is of extreme value that has not been perhaps receiving the same kind of attention is the other part of a possible definition of life. So how do we abstract the idea of self-maintenance, self-sustaining systems? So I do think that we also need some kind of axis here. So we actually need an axis that does not tell us, that does not follow evolution per se, but that follows a different kind of, measure. So how do we go from something that is, life on one end, Terran life as we know it here on Earth, to something that is very simple, but it is a necessary precursor of something that can become life. Now, here I'm going to try and go from, this perhaps more complex and more interesting stuff that we are all talking about. So life as we know it here on Earth, octopuses, there are a very, random, say, animal that I chose just because I actually like octopuses quite a lot. Astrobiology is some sort of, generalization of life on Earth. So we heard that perhaps life on Titan is not, a very, promising venue, which is great because I had a question mark there. So thumbs up for that. We have the realm of artificial life. So we've seen something from the talks before. Here I'm mentioning the game of life. I will have a slide at the very end where I say something about that as well. But basically, I'm just trying to list a bunch of examples of what I think are relevant parts that we need to understand, especially mathematically, if we want to be able to say what life is in a very formal way. Here, I'm pretty sure many of you will think I'm a bit ambitious if I mention cognition in a talk about life, but there is something that I could say about that, but probably not right now, maybe say in a discussion later. Autopoietic systems, so the idea that you have systems that are basically forming themselves. This is true not only for life, it's true as well for a bunch of out of equilibrium systems in physics, say hurricanes. We have adaptive systems, we have robots that can basically follow specific plans, so they can adapt to very simple disturbances to their behavior. We have systems with goals, and here, I'm going to go in more detail in a couple of slides. What I mean by goals, especially here, the point is we have a concept of systems. We can at least, perhaps, I hope, agree all here in this room and perhaps also outside that we need at least a concept of system. Now, what I'm going to try to do is basically go back from this concept of system to the smaller one and then try and, stop where I think the main bottleneck, at least from a mathematical perspective, is currently. So when we think about systems, we have a very nice notional dynamical system. We can clearly generalize what I have here. This is just, on the right, just a standard example of a Lorentz attractor, chaotic system. The point is we have a very nice notional dynamical system. More recently, some of this stuff is also being generalized and, beautifully expressed in more abstract mathematical language. Point being, we sort of know what a system is. System with goals. Well, here, I will tell you what I think a good candidate is. I'm not going to claim this is the final answer, but I'm pretty sure this will be part of a final answer. If we look at, physics, and if we look just at some different ideas from mathematics, we have very simple intuitions for what it means for a system to have a very, basic notion of goal. We can write down some optimization functional, and then we can say, well, where will the state of the system be after, n time steps or whatever, if we're in discrete time, or for t equals something, whatever. We can sort of write down a mathematical description of long-term behavior or dynamical systems. Now, does this mean that this is live? Well, no, but the point is this is a precursor of something that needs to be live. Classical example, Hamilton's principle, stating nothing new here. The point is we can kind of know that if we put a ball, like, on some slope, it will roll downhill. If we look at adaptive systems, well, here we have some more like an extension of the physics perspective. So we can take optimal control theory and see it just as an extension of some of this idea from physics, the variational stuff especially. I like to think of it as sort of like physics with inputs. So what we have to determine, like in optimal control, is a list of inputs, a list of actions that a particular system will exert on another system in order to control it, in order to stabilize it, in order to have it follow a specific long-term behavior. Well, the point here is that we have sneakily introduced a concept that is something like a controller, something like an agent, something that, provides actions to another system. So the physics stuff actually stops right before that. There's no magic controller. There's no other system that does any of the control of another system, unless you go to very specific examples, and then you kind of see that that's already like proving my point. We also have something that has to do with homeostasis at this stage. So what does adaptation means? Well, it means that, I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with the idea of homeostasis. Like if it's too hot, we basically start sweating. If it's too cold, we start shivering. The point here is that, well, not only do we have this very simple notion of homeostasis, we can formalize it in a mathematical way, in control theory. We can formalize it as well, like in a way that makes sense for trajectories. So we have these various names for sort of like the same idea: heterostasis, homeodynamics, homeokinesis, homeorasis, etc. The very fundamental point, however, is that homeostasis implies that there is a system, sort of like an agent, a controller, and there is another system, this system that is being controlled. And the system that does the control, the controller or agent, actually contains an internal model of the system being controlled. This is a very old idea that comes from cybernetics in the 50s and 60s. And nowadays, it is a very well established, I guess, point in various fields, including biology. And when I say biology, I mean biology at various scales. So it can go all the way from, single cellular systems all the way up to very complex ones. The point is that this is some sort of like necessary feature of living systems. If you want some sort of intuition for why that is, well, think of, say, a system that is trying to preserve its own structure, is trying to preserve its own properties, and receives a bunch of inputs from an external system, an environment that it doesn't like, some perturbations. Well, the only way for it to persist and the only way for it to actually, counteract these perturbations is to emit, some sort of action, some sort of output that counteracts these perturbations. And this is what, at the end of the day, actually lies at the bottom of this idea of internal models. I won't go through some of the maths here. I will have a couple of slides, well, one, just later on to show you that there is actually a way to do this very formally, on top of these papers that are already sketching some of the features that I'm actually looking for. If you're familiar with the idea of perfect adaptation in biology, well, this is kind of an example that people are using nowadays as an example of the point that I'm trying to show here. So the fact that homeostasis requires some internal model by a controller of a certain environment. Here we get to something that Netta mentioned in her talk before. Well, the word was different. It was identity. Here I'm just using the word individuation. But here is where I guess I want to focus for the last few minutes of this talk, because here is where I think we have a very clear bottleneck, a very clear theoretical bottleneck for what exactly is going on. we know what a system is, but the point is that being a system is not enough to be a living system. So we can take a system, we can take a dynamical system, and we can compose them somehow. We have a very well-developed theory or composition of systems. It's not really clear, however, for example, if I give you a big dynamical system, let's say a big chemical soup of some kind, whether you can actually tell me, say, whether there is a living system inside it. Well, this will be also part of the discussion, especially for tomorrow's session. The point is, we don't even have a theory, a precise theory for ways to think about this. So the proposal that me and some of my colleagues are putting through is trying to I don't know, take a few steps in a direction that actually gets us to a definition of individuality or identity. And it is, once again, by abstracting properties of things that we already see. So if I told you that, if I tell you that homeostasis implies internal models, well, first we need a good definition of internal models. And second, I want to understand what internal models are in general and when they are useful beyond the notion of homeostasis. So here I'm bringing out the idea of models that are too simple. So this is an example that I tried to work out in some presentation before. Think of yourself as being outside this castle, and think of yourself as trying to conquer this castle, and think of your enemy as being somebody inside this castle trying to defend it. Now, models that are usually used in biology right now are of the kind that are called too simple, because they sort of assume that there is a synchronization between what's inside and outside. So there's just enough information inside that you can see it, that you can see whatever is inside is basically synchronizing with what's outside. Well, that's good, but that basically happens with any sort of physical system that shows any sort of synchrony. So that's not very useful for a definition of life. So what we are doing with some colleagues is basically extend this point and trying to get to a notional model that is not too simple. And a notional model that is not too simple starts from some of these maps. So we write down dynamical systems, we write down maps between them, we write down when a map is a model, and then we basically show what a model that is too simple really is. Now, a model that is not too simple is a model that we claim is using Bayes to basically do the updates of some internal state, or at least it will look like it's using Bayes. It doesn't really have to do it, but it has to be interpreted in a way that makes it consistent with Bayes' theorem. So if you're familiar with it, this is just a way to do updates, given information, given observations from the outside. Models that are too simple are not using information from the outside because they already contain all of the relevant information. So this is the result that we basically have in a paper that we put out just a few months ago, where we are trying to show exactly what some of the limitations with current approaches are and what we actually may need to be able to overcome this bottleneck for this particular notion of individuation. I will close with a special mention to an approach that I couldn't really unpack in full detail. Randall Beer, one of my academic heroes, has been studying the game of life and structuring the game of life for a long time, and actually has a very thorough understanding of the physics, the chemistry, and say various other properties of gliders in the game of life. I recommend his series of 4 or 5 papers by now. Really great approach. And with that, I will get to my final summary. So let's take life more seriously. Let's take it seriously also in artificial systems. Let's take seriously the idea of abstraction. Let's take seriously the idea of mathematical theory and mathematical theory applied to, say, definitions of life. And last but not least, some of the intuitions that we use nowadays for internal models in biology, which are kind of crucial to really understand what is going on for homeostasis and self-sustaining systems, are a bit too simple. We actually need something more complex. We might have it. We just need to sort of show that it actually works in practice. And with that, thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. So we now have another break, and we will reconvene for the audience questions and panel discussion afterwards. See you then.